Welcome to this month's Autodesk Tandem webinar. I'm Jessica Kelly, the Director of Operations for the Autodesk Tandem team, and we're delighted to have you here with us today. Can you advance the slide, please, Tim? Just a reminder that the things we talk about today may include future statements about planned or future development. Anything we say today could change over time and is not a promise or guarantee of future delivery. Therefore, you should not make purchase decisions based on statements made during this webinar. Now let's review our agenda for today. Next slide, Tim. Today, we're going to do a brief overview of Autodesk Tandem and then dive into product updates that include features such as rooms and spaces, view management, and an Excel plugin. I've got just a couple more things to cover before we get started. First, we are recording today's webinar. This recording will be available on our new website, intandem.autodesk.com, on the resources page, so you can rewatch this webinar again. Also note, there's a Q&A tab in the Zoom webinar, and we're going to use that throughout the webinar to answer questions today. You'll also find a chat area, and we would love to interact with you there as well. Please do keep questions in the Q&A section to make it easier for our team to answer your questions. And we will also pick from those questions for our live Q&A at the end of this webinar. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to turn this over to Tim Kelly, our Senior Product Manager. Tim, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate that intro and housekeeping items. Before we get started, one more housekeeping item. We'd love to go ahead and launch a poll and get a little bit of information about our audience here so we know who we're talking to. So if you can answer the poll that just popped up, the question is, what's your role? And we have some general categories, and we'll give this just a few seconds to all right. Perfect. Okay, we have a really good spread again today. So it's good to see a good cross-section of the broad industry represented. Thank you, guys. So we're going to move on. And to start, we'll provide a quick update or an overview of Autodesk Tandem, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob for that, and then we'll dive into product update and demonstration.
Thanks, Tim. As we've discussed before, Autodesk Tandem was created to support really your digital transformation and help you move up the digital twin maturity scale, empowering owner and operators to realize their digital twin vision. With Autodesk Tandem, you can create and execute a repeatable process for curating a descriptive digital twin through digital handover. And this is really our key focus area at the moment. With Autodesk Tandem, that really helps owners accelerate their operational readiness. In the future, we'll be connecting Autodesk Tandem to operational workflows and systems to break down data silos and give you really a single pane of glass for operating your facility. Analyzing operational data collected will empower you to have greater insights and inform future decisions. One build here, Tim, just to indicate we really are focused deeply on that digital handover piece with a future expansion on smarter operations and greater insight. Next slide, Tim. We've talked a lot about this maturity model around digital twins, starting with this notion of a descriptive twin, which is really an as-built representation of the asset spaces and systems in a facility. Doesn't need to contain LOD 500 models with every nut and bolt in the curtain wall, needs to contain all of those operational assets and an index to all of that information you need to operate a facility effectively. Adding to that, capabilities to connect to operational systems makes that twin informative, and of course, starting to collect that operational data as predictive capabilities. Moving up the scale further, getting into comprehensive twins adds what-if type scenarios, simulation, if you will, and eventually getting to that holy grail of an autonomous twin that can operate on behalf of occupants and or self-tune a facility. Obviously, business value goes up as you move left to right. Level of digital transformation also goes up. One more build here, Tim. As I said, our near-term focus very much focused on that descriptive twin, and you'll see a lot of that in Tim's demo today. midterm focus on informative and predictive capabilities. Next slide, Tim. As we break this down and think about our existing and planned workflows and personas for Autodesk Tandem, we really think about it in these buckets of having an offering called Autodesk Tandem, which is in market today, really focused on digital handover, that ability to specify all of your asset and space information requirements, tools integrated with our portfolio to help you aggregate, view, query, update, and normalize all that asset and space data, and then tools to verify those outcomes to ensure you have a complete descriptive twin and be able to hand that over to an owner, including things like dashboards to really report on where you are in the progress in the process. Adding to that in the future, we'll think about an offering called Autodesk Tandem Pro, really starting to connect into those operational systems, being able to ingest and correlate event data to really monitor a facility through a single pane of glass. Operational capabilities, adding BIM 360 Ops into the equation, really starting to have that mobile-centric predictive plan to on-demand maintenance capabilities and eventually predictive capabilities. All of this is built on something we call the Tandem platform, which is really a set of APIs built on top of Forge, giving you access to all of that rich asset space and system information. A build here, Tim? So just to further clarify, our existing focus and near term is really on that specify and capture. You're going to see some really good stuff from Tim Kelly in terms of capabilities coming online in the very near future around this. One more build, Tim. As we get into the fall, we'll start to release some APIs into beta that will start to allow those integrations to happen. One more build, Tim. And we're starting some proof of concepts really around that verification and monitoring capability, integrating that asset data to really show you how you can leverage that downstream in operations. Over to you, Tim.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that update. So we'll dive into some work that's happening within the product team right now. And we've generally bucketed that into 3 categories: UI improvements, data management, and rooms and spaces. Each of these we've talked about quite a bit in the past, but this is ongoing work and obviously ever changing. So we wanted to give the most current update, and we'll start with UI improvements. We've gotten a lot of feedback as we've had you guys engage with the beta and now the product that is released around some interactions that we like to continue to simplify, make easier, and make more prominent in our product. A couple of those right now are a hierarchical filter capability. I'll show that with the classification property. That is a tree structure of information, and we can now group and ultimately select based on that hierarchical value. Second item here is combining levels. As we aggregate models from various sources, ultimately we need to normalize that information, and we're providing a workflow now to combine those. The third item here is view management. Views are a core construct in Tandem, and ultimately we want to continue to simplify access to various views and management of that data set. In terms of data management, we'll be showing you guys an Excel plugin we're working on at the moment where we can interact with a broad set of data, and we expect or hope that you guys are able to leverage that in a lot of different scenarios. And then I have some honorable mentions here in the data management work that's been ongoing for quite some time, and we've talked about in past webinars, but we're really starting to mature this on the engineering team and get these moving forward. But parameter set library, both in terms of the parameter sets as well as facility templates, will be coming soon. That's data that's prepared for you guys to use or leverage from various existing standards like COBie or IFC or Building Smart Data Dictionary types of structures that you would ultimately want to leverage within your facility template. And then document linking is something that we've talked about quite a bit in the past, but ultimately, today in Tandem, you have the ability to create a hyperlink to a document. But with this workflow, we'll be more directly interacting with the file browser and incorporating documents directly into your assets and spaces within Tandem. I am noting that those two are honorable mentions because I don't actually have anything to demonstrate on those today, but I just wanted to let you guys know that that is coming and work that we're progressing forward on. The third category is rooms and spaces. Ultimately, we'll be showing a demonstration, walking through the ability to now visualize spaces more directly within Tandem, view and edit that space data, both in terms of categorizing and adding additional parameters, as well as cross-referencing models and leveraging spaces from one model to search and sort assets from a variety of models. So let's dig in and I'll show you these different features both in slides so we can kind of talk to it a bit, and then I'll walk through a demonstration. So in terms of hierarchical filter, what you ultimately see here is now within a few specific or special properties, we have the ability to create a data tree. So classifications or classification systems that you're managing within Tandem is one of them. And then systems, which is data that's sourced out of the source models, the Revit models from the assembly code is another. In both of these cases, I can group and organize individual asset types by categories. And what we're allowing for within our filter capability now is that at any level, I can select a node, and then that will ultimately select the individual items below. With this, in the case that you're looking at metals in the center of the screen here, I can see that I have elements within my metal fabrications, metal stairs, and pipe and tube railings, but there actually isn't anything assigned directly to metals division 5 as a whole. So this is a grouping level. And what I can see here is if I select this, it's going to select all the asset types or the categories below. And ultimately, this is a special treatment here because this is a value with no assets directly assigned to it. And so we're creating that tree structure for simplicity and the ability to really quickly search for and find appropriate groups of assets. I'll show that in the demonstration in just a second, but just as an overview, these are for special properties. In the future, we'll extend this to additional properties and we'd love to get some feedback on what those might look like. In terms of combining levels, we certainly see this all the time, and we know you guys are familiar with the notion that when you aggregate models, your structural levels, your mechanical levels, your architectural levels are often named differently. And when those come into a system like Tandem, where you're federating files, you're federating your models, and ultimately you get something that looks like this, where there is a difference in naming or how each of these are treated. So in order to normalize these, we're allowing for those to be renamed, and as they're renamed, they can be grouped together. So in the case that I now am displaying a short list of first floor, second floor, third floor, fourth floor, and roof, these are now a combination of what was previously incorporated as your source models. We do maintain a connection to that source model level and understand there's a relationship between this new label or this new name and the source file, so that as I incorporate updates to my models, we can map those updates into those new levels. So what that means is this isn't tagged at the element level, this is at the level name. And what that allows for is, in any case that I have something that was on one of those previously displayed level names, that will be incorporated rather than bringing one of those previous names back into our list of floors here. In the case of updating the UI for our view management capability, we have restructured the panel a bit. So you guys should see this in production in the near future, where we've reorganized the search and sort capability right above the list. So it's really clear and connected to that list of views as you build out a comprehensive list. We also now allow for updating an existing view. Previously, if you wanted to update, you just saved it as a new view. Whereas now, if I have an existing view selected and I go and I make updates to the camera position or to my filters or to my inventory, I can save that view. In addition to saving that view, I can duplicate it or use it as a reference and do a save as new. So I have that ability to start from, potentially a system and then create a view, drill down further to a subsystem and save a new view and continue to work that way. So I can build out the appropriate views of my data as we work through that. Additional note here is that we are working on categorizing views, so adding some additional metadata on that view so we can create groups. So in the case you see my view names here with the indicator of what it is at the beginning, so mechanical assets or clusters or rooms, I could create those as groups and ultimately then either search for the group and get that direct group, or ultimately just see visually that grouping displayed within the list here. Next item on our list is our Excel plugin. This is work that has been ongoing primarily to begin testing out our API development. And ultimately, we expect, when we think about data contribution into Tandem, we do expect a number of different sources. And if we were to poll everyone today on what kind of data you have for assets, whether it be in commissioning or otherwise, oftentimes it's, hey, I have an Excel file that I can share, and this is where the data is stored. And in terms of interacting with other systems, other solutions that you would be capturing this data or sourcing this data from, oftentimes the export out of those systems is a CSV file or directly an Excel file. What we expect to see is that we'll be building out some direct connections with a number of different platforms or other solutions. However, we don't expect we'll be able to cover them all. They vary wildly. And ultimately, the common ground is very typically an Excel file. So we want to make that interaction as simple as possible. Today, we have within our inventory the ability to take a data set in the inventory, export that out to Excel, make changes and reincorporate that. But we wanted to provide a little more of a direct connection to sourcing that information from Excel, both with the asset and space data, so all of that data capture, but also with the specification data in terms of how you define or manage your classification systems, your parameter sets, and your facilities. So within this plugin, we're providing kind of a comprehensive administrative package for both capturing and managing data within Tandem, but leveraging the capabilities that are in Excel and leveraging that notion that we can connect to other sources in this manner. So that said, with this plugin, you have the ability to take data in bulk out of Tandem to use for your own sort of reporting or dashboarding downstream, or you have the ability to edit data or live synchronize that data that you're incorporating back into the Tandem database to use within our environment. Last on our list here is rooms and spaces. What you're seeing on screen here in this screenshot is, and it's light, but you can probably see this external boundary that is the room. That room is from the architectural model here. So in the case that I have the architectural model, previously what we've shown is this notion that I can find or source and display in my inventory all of the contents of that particular model. What we're able to do now is cross-reference all of these models with that space. And so we're ultimately providing like a spatial query across all of these models where as I drill into a particular space, in this case, I have mechanical room 321 selected. What I get as a result, both in my viewer as well as my inventory, is the contents of all of the various models. So I have electrical, fire protection, HVAC, plumbing, site, in this case not included, structural and telecom. So all of the things that are contained within that space from each of those source models are displayed here and referenced within this space. What's important here is we want to take the burden of making that kind of association off of the end user and allow for those spaces that are created in your source models to be referenced and leveraged to create this relationship. We think it's important as we kind of think about our broader information model. We have this relationship between assets, spaces, and systems within a facility that will allow for correlations to be drawn between your specification or your program data and your upstream performance requirements or planned requirements. And then ultimately, as we move downstream, we curate all of this information and we want to begin connecting to events as the facility moves into operations. All of that correlation allows for better analytics and better understanding what's going on within your facility by referencing that correlated data. In addition to that cross-referencing capability, we also know that as I begin to work with spaces or rooms within a platform like Autodesk Tandem, it's beneficial to be able to both visualize that, but also provide an inventory or a room schedule of that data so I can work with that and categorize it and ultimately begin associating the asset data I want captured or that space data I want captured for the long-term management of the facility. With this, when I bring models into our system, so I publish models into Tandem, I can ultimately visualize those and I can search for them just like any other category. So if you're not very familiar with Revit, everything in those source models are structured in categories, families, and types, essentially. Within the rooms and spaces category, those are objects as you see on screen, but the way that those systems that Revit treats that data is that they're invisible objects. Essentially, they can be displayed on 2D documentation, et cetera, but by default, they're off. And in a system like Tandem, as we bring in that information and provide, context to search for it, to interact with it, we need to treat that in a special way, because if we, turn all of these things on, ultimately you can't see the assets contained within them. So we're working through an appropriate way to treat this. And I have some poll questions in just a minute here that I'd love to ask. But the idea is, as we're interacting with models and beginning to categorize assets and spaces, and ultimately in the near future systems as well, we think about this interaction between these things where I can drill in on spaces specifically versus assets, but they are kind of intermingled. So I'll show that in just a minute. And I do have some poll questions specifically about your expectation here or considerations that we'd like to take into our next evolution of this. But for right now, what we're doing with those spaces is essentially, as you can see, that's a wireframe of all of the various rooms within this particular facility. So with that said, I'd like to jump into the product and demonstrate some of these capabilities and walk you through what we have going on within Tandem. All right, one second here. Okay, so within Tandem, we're going to start with the couple of UI elements that I'd mentioned. So what you can see here is, for my classifications property, I have now the ability to expand these groups. And ultimately, as I drill in on any of these particular groups, I can select that grouping level, or ultimately I can select individual components within that. So what you're going to see as you work with this particular property is This will make it really easy to select categories of things and how they're grouped together within your particular asset types. In this case, the classification system is defined in my management console or my management space, where I have created a custom classification system. You can see here that I have some assets, and then I've ultimately, in this case, created a couple of common spaces to start working with that. But in a system like Uniformat or Master Format, we'd expect these are very typically asset specific. But in something like an Omniclass or Uniclass, the system covers both products or assets as well as spaces and locations. And so we do expect in some cases that these are intertwined, and that classification system will be consistent both for your locations or your spaces as well as your assets. And so we have some work to further refine or define in the cases where these are split out or separate versus when you'd expect to see them together. Let me clear out my filtering here. In the case that we're interacting with that floors capability where I can rename or redefine my floors, what you're seeing here is that combined list of floors. And I will say, from our perspective, I think you guys are probably familiar with what's going on here if you've ever worked with models, but we are using that base level information. And very often you have, in this case, a curtain wall system or a panel system that is hosted on the base floor and it extends all the way up. And so we have some further work to refine that floor definition as a top and bottom, and then contain the assets that are within that. But certainly as we begin to combine models and allow for that level aggregation or normalization, we wanted to provide a really clean path for renaming those and defining that. Right now, I will show you how this interacts. I expect our UI to change a bit, but ultimately, this is a direct interaction with the facet here, that filter, where I can rename this floor as, let's say, second floor or fourth floor and roof, if I want to combine these together. And in this case, if I want, there we go, that to be combined with fourth floor and roof, I can do just that. And I'm not sure. I think I just found a bug there live for you guys, but ultimately these are combined together as you manipulate that. Ultimately, we are, as I mentioned, we are keeping the source information about the level maintained. So I have that data of what that reference level is. And so if we need to revert this, we'll provide that capability to say, let's uncombine or de-aggregate, I guess, take those back to that source. So again, this is work in progress. And as we are wrapping this up, we'll roll it out for you guys to begin testing and working with and interacting with. In the case of working with views, I'm currently in a view. I started from a view, and I can, as I edit or manipulate these filters, I can save that view as my current view. Or if I want to save as a new view, I have a drop down here to say save view as. In the case of searching for views or resorting the views, certainly I can search for my clusters and go jump into a view like that, or obviously search for the view by name directly if necessary. So for right now, that's the UI work that we've done and will continue to do as we prepare to roll out a handful of these out to production in the near couple of weeks, I suppose. So next up, we want to talk about spaces. So within our product, as I mentioned, when I bring in my source models, previously we Oh, goodness. Give me 1 second. I have I think Google Chrome just crashed on me. So I am going to, as I hit recover, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll question. No, you know what? Let's just get right into it. Let's see. I'm going to go and refresh. I think we should be okay. All right, back at it. Okay, apologies. I had a, I guess, WebGL issue within Chrome, but we are all good. So as I mentioned in the slides, rooms and spaces, or ultimately they're considered Revit categories. Previously, we treated these as hidden categories, and so you couldn't specifically isolate or select those here. Now what we're doing is, as we have them set, essentially to transparent or wireframe, I can interact with them just like any other elements from my models. And as I interact with them, I get a representation of that data or those individual instances within my inventory. What this means is, as I think about the notion of filtering and contributing data to particular types of things, I can isolate, I can interact with the properties of these things, I can look at the design properties as appropriate, and I can categorize and assign additional information. With this, though, and with the notion of treating these as a reference for finding assets, ultimately, we also cross-reference, as mentioned, all of the models where I can now search by room or by space, and navigate to a specific container or space to identify all of the assets contained within. So this is important because as we think about the notion of defining all of your assets, oftentimes assets are tagged or organized with the reference to that location. And prior to this kind of capability, that's a very manual task to assign where a particular pump is located as part of his equipment ID, or understand the layout and the structure of the building as we want to begin contributing data and think about the notion of, okay, my mechanical contractor is finished in this particular mechanical room, and we can begin commissioning process for some equipment in there, or we can go through the process of capturing that installation data for that particular room. So we can really begin to leverage this as that cross-referencing of those multiple models, but of also leveraging that space to select and find the assets contained within that space. The last here is I'm going to jump into our Excel plugin. Give me just 1 second to get that loaded up.
The spaces. Go ahead, Tim.
Oh, no, go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say the spaces feature is pretty exciting because it starts to normalize all of this information across Revit models where you can't aggregate that data in a room across those models. So that's one of the powerful capabilities here. As we take this feature forward, obviously we want to move beyond Revit levels or Revit spaces and rooms, and allow you to actually create and modify the space and room geometry. That'll be upcoming work in the future, but it's certainly on our roadmap and plans.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bob. So there is one thing that I will say we'd love some feedback on, and that is, as we ingest this information into Tandem, the contents are all the same. As I mentioned, spaces are treated as categories and sit alongside all of your other background information or context, as well as those things that you'll tag as assets. And initially, we were working towards an intentional construct of separating these things. And ultimately, as you define them and apply data, they will be separated, and the way we interact with them downstream will provide for different workflows that are ultimately separate. But as we work with model data and as we work to incorporate that information model or that facility template into your data set, it started to make sense that we leave these intertwined and we allow for you to make the decision of how you expect to interact with them. So in the case that I, go in, I could potentially, if I want to, look at some assets and also some rooms. And our inventory is going to represent that combined. So it really puts the workflow on the end user, on yourselves, to define how I want to look at specific data and what information I'm applying. So I'm going to launch a poll. And as I describe that, our overall concept and our construct is that we leave these intertwined. So when we load the models into Tandem, does it make sense that assets and spaces are intertwined? Or does it make more sense if we ultimately separate them out and you categorize and classify your assets, and then you do the same thing for spaces, but they aren't able to be displayed in the same manner? I will generally say it looks like the preferred answer here is this makes sense, with the secondary not far behind is I'm not sure. And I'm glad to see that the priority or the thinking makes sense, and that there are some that aren't quite sure what they would use this for. So as we continue to work through this, what we want to do is provide clarity on how you're interacting with this data. And so from a user experience here, we need to treat this, I generally say, really carefully, so that you're not doing something unintentionally. So for those that are unsure, I think, in my mind, that raises the need to make sure that, as you're interacting with this stuff, we visually treat it a bit differently, or we provide indication for what you're working with and how you're working with that information, to make sure that it is ultimately crystal clear what you'd like to be doing.
I think at the end of the day, Tim, as we think about the owner experience and the operator experience, it makes sense for spaces to be a navigable concept along with assets. So I can find things by space or by asset. It's really a question of, as we're curating this data, does it make sense to completely separate them or keep them combined?
That's exactly right.
That's where Tim and I wrestle with this idea of, is a space an asset or is a space a separate concept? Downstream in the owner's experience, we are convinced they are two separate concepts. But
thanks, Bob. That's great. So I'm going to jump right into a next poll question, because this is directly related to spaces. And before we move into Excel, it makes sense to ask this. But I'm going to launch this poll question. And the question is, when we assign assets to spaces, should this be available as a property that you can leverage for other workflows? Right now, given an asset like a duct can ultimately be in multiple spaces, we do have more than one space reference to that, so that if you select the mechanical room or the adjacent game room in this case, that will be incorporated in both spaces. And so we're working through how that will be referenced on more than one component, but allow for you to interact with that property. And I'm going to say the winner here is yes. I think I agree here. We need to figure out the appropriate way to treat that and then give you access to that. In my mind, though, I can see a situation where I want to create a equipment tag and concatenate that room or that space information, like a room number, with my asset type and with my, equipment ID or whatever it may end up being, to then give myself a single name or a single equipment tag for that particular component. So really good responses here, and I'm going to go ahead and close that out. Thanks for that feedback. All right, jumping into the last section here, I'm going to open up our Excel plugin. So within Excel, I'm in a workbook, and if I create a new sheet here, I can begin interacting with that asset data. In this case, from a configuration standpoint, just a login standpoint, I'm connected to an account and ultimately referencing a facility. And then I can begin either accessing views created within that facility or specifically interacting with the filters. In the case that I want to interact with views, I can leverage a particular view to say, bring in the information for that view. What this is going to do is just like our inventory loads in our application, it's going to make a call to go grab all of the assets for that view and then all of the data associated. So you can see that happen pretty quickly. And in this case, I think I have, about 1,700 assets. This is a lighting package. So about 1,700 items. And then I think in terms of, I haven't isolated specific columns to be pulled, but this is grabbing all of our standard, applied, Revit element and Revit type parameters. So I think in this case, we have about 300 columns. But here I can either begin leveraging this data external from our system for reporting or whatever you need to do, or I can directly interact with that. In the case that we have special properties like a classification code, if I double click in on this, you're going to interact with it like you would within Tandem, where you have a predefined list of properties. In this case, this is our classification system. So I'm defining an asset type here. So I can go ahead and point to electrical, and let's say like electrical lighting control. So I can update that. When I make that change here, ultimately that's going to push that information directly back into Tandem. So this is a live edit. So you noticed I just toggled that on as enable live. Ignore this is in progress and in engineering hands right now, but that allows for me to directly interact with this data. So in the case that I wanted to, quickly copy and paste that to multiple values, I can, again, treat this like any other Excel table where I can do VLOOKUPs or source data from elsewhere, bring it into this table, and then ultimately push that into Tandem. In the case that I want to interact with filters and filter down an explicit selection where I don't yet have a view, this is, grabbing all of the defined filters. If I actually pull open Tandem here, those two buttons, the facets button right now is actually going to ultimately allow you to control which filters you're working with. So just like you can within Tandem. And then that filters button is actually going to give you that list of properties that I can drill in on and say, I want to find the, duct fittings or whatever it might be. So in this case, you can see those properties here, and I can say, level 1. Let's make it really easy. Interiors, and let's further define, let's say doors. So doors on level 1, interior doors on level 1. So this is going to dump that data into my table here. And again, I can interact with this and contribute data back to Tandem, or take it downstream as appropriate. Lastly here, we don't have the rest of the specification data set up, but I'd like to show the classification component. In this case, if I want to interact with classification systems that I've got defined within Tandem, I can bring those down into Excel. I can change my name here. And ultimately, I have the ability to pull down an update or refresh the source if I need to pull it back down from Tandem. I can push this into Tandem. I also can validate that this is that everything is correct and accurate. In the case that we're working with the classification system, the code should be unique, and the level of that tree structure is defined here. So we're providing some validation on that. What you'll notice too, though, is I'm not able to ultimately enter duplicate codes here. We see a lot of times when a classification system is referenced from another source, say an existing CMMS system or otherwise, you may end up with a situation where you're copying and pasting information, and maybe there's some duplicate values here. What we're thinking with this, ultimately with this plugin, is to provide much broader validation and clarity around what we'd expect to see in Tandem, so that you can ultimately push that into our system. So in the case that I just pushed that update, if I go into my Manage tab here and go to those simple, wrong one, I think simple groups, I can see here that I have a new version that stores Windows Mechanical as I just decided to quickly define, and that's now updated in my system. In the case that I have information that was edited within a particular facility, I'm also going to get notifications of those changes. So if I want to jump back into that property edit, I can see in my history here that Tim Kelly at this timestamp edited this property for this particular element, and go find that element. Apologies, I do have some WebGL issues in my Google Chrome browser, so not highlighting that at the moment, but you do get to see that full comprehensive history. So for any of these elements, I can drill into that data set. I can see that history as things have changed over time, and that's always going to be a part of your event history, whether it's from directly in our product or from an external source. All right, so before we jump into Q&A, I'm going to launch one final poll question, and this is related to that Excel plugin workflow. And there are actually two questions in here. Based on the facility types that you work with or the data that you work with, could the Excel plugin be heavily utilized, is the first question. And the second question is, what type of data would you expect to incorporate through Excel? Again, I think, as I mentioned, our thought here is it's going to wildly vary, and we expect that funnel to be large and coming from a lot of different sources. But I just wanted to kind of get a general sense of if it's primarily commissioning or primarily installation data. And the poll question looks like it kind of validated our expectations, is that it's pretty consistent across those groups. And I think we have an almost a nearly even spread across all of the above there. All right. That's fantastic. Thank you guys for that. Fantastic feedback. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll, and we're going to jump into our Q&A session to wrap us up.
Thanks, Tim. I've got a number of questions for you and Bob today.
I'm certain of it.
Yeah. Since we were just talking about Excel plugin, let's answer some of those questions first. So, is it possible to add new parameters to the Revit model using the Excel plugin? Like, for example, adding a new column for model number?
Yeah, so it will be possible, and our parameters are not Revit parameters. They are specific to Tandem, and we do allow for mapping between Revit parameters and the sets that we maintain within the Tandem application. But certainly, as you saw in our plugin, we have this notion of incorporating parameter sets and working with those here directly. So you would be able to update your parameter set or incorporate a parameter as appropriate. And then when you apply that to a particular asset type or a classification code, that will then inherit or exist on that particular set of components. So that workflow is certainly going to be possible within that Excel plugin.
Great. Now, is it possible to choose what exports to Excel, like, for example, only export maintainable assets, et cetera, identified for COBie to limit what's in the Excel?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So in that filtered data set, you can either do the work in Tandem to create those views, like that COBie data is filtered by particular classification code or data drop date or whatever it may be that you're leveraging. So you can set that up in predefined views in Tandem, or within our filters capability, what you have the ability to do is, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong workbook. So that is not logged in. 1 second. The one I was just working in. You can leverage a property like, in our case, that classification code is essentially what you're defining as your maintained assets. Everything that's unclassified would be, or unassigned would be your context. So walls, concrete, the things that you're not attaching data to. So in this case, as I define these things, I can say I want to, either I select all of these and unselect my classification system, or certainly you could apply a property that is essentially, I want to say this is a maintained asset.
I think the question there, Tim, is filtering the column list down to just the asset data from Tandem, not all of the Revit.
Oh, yes, certainly. So apologies on that. Yes, if I just want the data that's part of my asset parameters applied, you'll have that ability to specify which columns.
So if that's a Kobe deliverable, then I would
Yes.
just get the Kobe columns
Yes.
in my Excel sheet.
Thanks for clarifying, Bob. I missed that.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
Hey, Tim, speaking of classification, where does the classification come from, and how are Revit objects different than Tandem classifications?
Yeah. So within Tandem, we have this notion of a facility template, and that contains both the parameter sets where they exist, but also which structure you want to incorporate for your asset information. So we allow for selecting industry standards, and we'll have, I think right now we have master format and uniformat applied, but we'll incorporate Uniclass, OmniClass, and some other AEC standards. However, oftentimes this is a discussion amongst the project team in terms of what deliverable is expected. So if that's something to follow a system that's already in place within a CMMS product that your client or the owner operator leverages today, we can import that or incorporate that. As you saw through that Excel plugin, I can ultimately manipulate the classification system and bring that into our product. The reason this is important is we need to provide a coding schema, a definition of the asset types and ultimately the asset groups or categories that I define. And today you can do some of that in Revit, and we can ultimately map if that happens in Revit, but oftentimes we see that not happening in Revit. Or you have a number of different source files and you want to normalize all that with a single standard and a single asset information model. That can happen here in Tandem. So I will say we follow the asset information requirements defined in the ISO 19650 Division 3 spec. And the idea there is, you have a project information model, and there is a handover point in time to pass that data into the owner operator's asset information model. And as the team is appointed, as you bring on the design entities, the architects, engineers, contractors to contribute, this is a discussion facilitated by that delivery team to say, this is how we expect to deliver these things, and this is the data that we want for these different categories or these different asset types. We're following that spec because right now we see no general standard across, globally across the industry. There are different geographies that have specific classification systems in place or specific building types that do. But we ultimately know this needs to be flexible because it varies all over. And so we're providing that capability to normalize that data in Tandem and then associate the appropriate information that's part of that descriptive digital twin.
Thanks, Tim. I've got a question for you, Bob. If this is digitally a true twin, how would changing room geometry be possible and then not applying those changes back to the source model?
It's a complex question. And really it's complex because of the way Revit handles room geometry. Typically that room geometry is defined in a single model. And what we want to do is normalize that geometry and make it accessible across multiple models. So which model does that room geometry go back to is the first question that we would have to figure out there. So the idea is to bring Revit data forward and structure it in a way in Tandem that it is useful to the owner. So Revit is treated as a source. Again, our parameter data in Tandem, we don't modify parameter data and push that back to Revit either. We bring it into Tandem parameters that sit on top of the Revit data and really are the data that an owner and operator is going to care about at handover and beyond. So it's really about normalizing all that Revit information and bringing it forward as opposed to pushing it back.
What about pushbacks to BIM 360? So like if you update a BIM file, isn't a BIM file that's imported into BIM 360, are the updates pushed back to BIM 360?
No, same answer there, right?
Yeah, okay.
We do not modify Revit parameter data directly in Tandem. They are read-only inside of Tandem. You can map those into Tandem's asset parameters and modify the Tandem asset parameter values, but we do not modify the Revit data directly.
So this next question is really about how Tandem aggregates data. So how does Tandem aggregate data when changes to the source model are updated? Like, are we using an element ID or a GUID or something? Like, what happens when you? Okay.
Yes, we use the Revit element ID, the GUID, and so anytime there's a change to a Revit source, we understand, we bring in that source. If there's a mapping done to an asset parameter, we'll remap that new value. If the data has been overridden in Tandem, we will not overwrite it again. We will keep and preserve the data that's been input into Tandem.
And just for reference, Jessica, we do provide access to that GUID. So both the external IDs of that GUID for the element exists in the inventory if you need to reference it for other things you want to connect to. And you also have access to the model GUID, which is important because we do provide an ID for each individual model, given you will be providing updates from those model sources. And we want to allow for both that model reference as well as the element reference. So if anyone needs to access that for any reason, they're part of the data set that you have access to.
Thanks for that clarification, Tim. I appreciate it. Hey, Bob, I think we have one more. Well, we have time for one more question. Bob, is there a plan to link insight or energy modeling data like weather site condition?
Absolutely. As we go forward, all types of event data is critical to a digital twin. So again, as we think about operational data, that could be work order events, that could be performance events from IoT sensors, humidity, temperature, et cetera. That could be sensors on flow rates in a pump, that could be weather data, that could be any type of data. So that event data is part of our future roadmap as we think about expanding into operational scenarios with Tandem, normalizing that event data, bringing it in, being able to correlate that data is directionally where we see this product going.
Thanks, Bob. Hey, Tim, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I think we have just a closing slide you want to talk through.
Yeah, I think just some closing statements, and I'll give Bob a second to jump in as well. But you guys saw us kind of bounce through a bunch of different product updates, and we're working a lot of different areas around that data aggregation, so that specify and capture phase. And as Bob mentioned, we're starting to build out some proof of concepts around connecting to external systems, the notion of incorporating event data, that sort of thing. And we're excited for this community to get engaged and provide us feedback as you do in the polls here, but more directly as you start using the product and ultimately leveraging these capabilities to curate your information for that initialization of a digital twin. So I will say it takes very little time to get started, and it is free to get started. So we do have a couple of links here. If you go to the link listed at the bottom of the page, or I believe shared in the chat, you can get signed up today. If you want to make sure that we contact you when we give updates, so webinar invitations and other updates, certainly through that link, you can get subscribed to our information, and you can also find us on LinkedIn at the link there as well. Bob, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, their closing comment is there's lots of interest in our roadmap, and the roadmap is also public and on the website. So if you don't see a feature that you want, you can actually request it through the website. You can also vote on features on the website. So our roadmap is public, it is on the website, and encourage your participation there as well. And we really appreciate that feedback and insight that you guys are all providing.
Well, thank you, Bob and Tim and everyone else for attending today. As I mentioned earlier, we'll make the recording available on our new website in tandem.autodesk.com on the resources page. And Tim's showing that roadmap right now. So go visit us online.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.